Cool. Well, and it depends on your engagement as well. So, hi everyone, I'm Chris. I am a game designer and product manager who's originally from Romania. I'm a graduate from the University of Suffolk, and I recently got a lot more involved with the games industry and especially the education behind the games industry in the east of England. That's how the idea for Game Anglia came to be. We put together a really awesome team, and we had a good event last November. Some of the people here who have actually attended, I think, can tell you more about that. However, what's really what I'm really passionate about is games as an art medium. And you're here at the Norwich University of the Arts studying games, so I think that most of you kind of think that games are an art medium, right? And especially propaganda and ideas, because ideas are really important. If anybody has ever seen Inception, right? Once an idea is formed, you can't actually take it out. So I kind of want to ask you, you're not your whole year or the whole course, right?
No.
So why, let's have a show of hands and take some answers from you guys. Why was this talk important for you? First, can everybody hear me? Okay. Did everybody remember to put their phones on silent? Okay, so let's have a show of hands. Let's get some answers. Why was this talk important to you? Because I'm guessing it's not assessed.
No.
Okay, so why did you choose to come here today?
To learn,
Okay,
get information from someone who's more experienced in the games industry.
okay, yeah,
You have experience and you can be a future contact for references and learning.
okay,
Because I do believe games are very politically charged a lot of times, but people tend to overlook it.
okay, yeah,
Getting different perspectives from different people in the industry in different roles is quite vital for thinking.
okay, yeah. Anybody else?
Where you're from, because you come from Romania.
Yeah.
They quite heavily, quite interesting past. So,
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I don't know how many of you know about the history of of Eastern Europe. I'm guessing some of you may actually be born in the year 2000 or thereabouts. Right, in 1989, there was the fall of the Iron Curtain. That's when the USSR started collapsing, and that's where when the Eastern Bloc started collapsing. Romania was one of the countries that was under Soviet influence. Although we were never actually part of the USSR, we were never actually communist. If you look at the past of the East of Europe, you'll see a much more turbulent past than, say, the UK or England or France or Spain have had. Not because we have had fewer wars than this side of Europe, but because we have had a lot more territorial changes. So between 1900 and today, Romania has been a kingdom. First it was 3 pieces of territory owned by different really big countries or empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and whatever was in the east. Anyway, we then became one full country in 1918. That then became a kingdom. That after the Second World War annexed some territory. And afterwards, we got embroiled with communism. We became a socialist republic, and then in 1989, we suddenly were left without a dictator, without clear leadership. There were riots. There was blood on the street for a few months, and then so there was a period of political turmoil up until the early 2000s, and then in 2007 we joined the European Union. I was born in 1992, so I only saw the more European side of it. But quite old being born in 1992?
1981.
Okay, cool.
That's why. Didn't expect that.
So there were quite some major changes within the span of about 3 generations, and you can go back and see a lot more of that before the 1900s. However, what's really important is to understand that Romania has gone through quite a few regime changes, quite a few ideology changes that my parents have been through, that my grandparents have been through, and that I've been part of. Now, my personal history is that, as I said, I'm a graduate from the University of Suffolk from the computer games design course. I then went and worked for Ubisoft. So if anybody's planning on getting hired at Ubisoft in Romania, do let me know. I can get you an interview most likely. And I then came back to the UK, wanting to do a bit more management and get more involved in education, and that's how I started giving talks at universities and colleges. That's how I got involved and with the community in this area. Then that kind of leads me to today and to propaganda and games, because I've seen these different cultures, right? I've seen the East and I've seen the West. Western Europe isn't that different from the US. Just like you, I play games, I read the news, and I keep seeing a lot of the ideas that are trying to be pushed by various agendas. So I'm here to talk to you about games as a propaganda medium. Let's try and understand a bit about what propaganda is. Does anybody have any ideas about how you define propaganda as a concept?
Like a piece of artwork used to design or manipulate someone's point of view about a certain subject matter.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Anybody else?
Isn't it used to sway political opinions? I think artwork is used to help move people what to do in a political sense.
Ish. From my point of view, propaganda is a message that's skewed to promote a point of view, usually political in nature. But as we'll see, you can create propaganda games or propaganda art without necessarily having a political message in mind, unless we get into discussing exactly what political mean. And I don't want to go there. What I want you to keep in mind is that propaganda is about manipulating somebody's perspective, about manipulating somebody's point of view, about sharing some information and not necessarily sharing other information, right? I'm not saying, and throughout the presentation I remind you of this, I'm not saying that the examples that we're going to give now are good or bad. I'm just sharing them because they are propaganda art, right?
Okay.
If you could, yeah. In terms of networking, really good to take photos and keep documents of the stuff that you're doing. Now, let's have a look at some actual propaganda art from before digital games. We have here the Communist Manifesto on one side, talking about how the masses should rise and there should be no aristocracy. That didn't necessarily work in the UK, but Marx actually spent quite a lot of time in London. Then we have something like Mein Kampf, which talks about how a certain group of people is evil and is trying to manipulate the world economy and they should be eradicated. So these are books, right? We've seen propaganda in books and in newspapers, in the written world. Then we have posters, like the campaigns from the Second World War, like the campaigns from the First World War, where you had messages showing the UK and America collaborating. So that's actually a poster from 1918. And then we move on to the more modern day with films like American Sniper and The Iron Lady. Again, these works of art in and of themselves are impressive, and they're showing certain points of view, right? Certain skewed points of view. Now, how does that work when you look at some of the more recent events, right? And if we look at Brexit, you had two camps. You had Leave and Remain, right? Both of these camps were talking about the same issue, right? Some of you may have voted on Brexit. If you could vote and you didn't vote, shame on you. If you did vote, congrats, no matter what side you chose. So you had the Leave campaign, which was trying to get three messages across, right? Independence, power, and taking back control, right? And you saw these in all of the media that was featured. You then have, that was featuring the Leave campaign. You then had the Remain campaign, right? Which was trying to talk about unity, solidarity, diversity. Now, both of these are different points of view on a single issue. Should the UK leave or stay in the EU? And what was important here was to realize that they were showing these messages to you from their perspective, with while leaving some things out, right? Both the Leave campaign and the Remain campaign didn't tackle some of the issues which didn't talk about their agenda, which didn't show their point of view, or they were actively dodging questions about that. Now, looking at games as propaganda, what you need to understand, and again, I think that you're completely aware of this. Games are a tool of artistic expression, and just like any tool, they can be used for any number of purposes. Right? Games are played by players, right? They're your consumers. Whether you have 1 player, 5 players, 5,000 players, or 5 million players, as was the case with the games that I worked on at Ubisoft, all of these people are interacting with your medium. And why are games really important as these tools of artistic expression? Well, if you look at a film, right, you interact with it for what, 2 hours, maybe a bit more if you're making GIFs and putting them online. When you look at an Instagram post or at a poster, you're looking at it for a few seconds. When you read a book, you're reading it maybe for 2 hours, 5 hours, 40 hours. But then you look at games and you realize that there's people who spend hundreds of hours in games, interacting with the games, interacting with the message that you've put in the game. And every decision that you guys take for the game needs to be informed, because there's going to be people, players, who are going to be affected by the choices, the design choices that you make. Now let's look at the numbers. Roughly, show of hands, who here has seen Black Panther? Okay, so you're part of the about 110 million people who have seen Black Panther, right? And that film has been regarded as a cornerstone for diversity and for the message that it was sending, right? And from that point of view, because it was showcasing certain issues, we can see it as a piece of propaganda. Now, if we're to look at games, again, these you watched Black Panther maybe once, twice, so what, 2-4 hours of interacting with it. If we look at games like Minecraft, who have had about 145 million players, we can see that games are starting to get serious, and they've started to get serious for a while now. The video game industry is making more money than the Hollywood industry, and it goes without saying, more people are spending more time in games than they are looking at films. So just imagine if Black Panther managed to get the press that it did, if it managed to inspire and to affect as many people as it did. Where are the games that can do that? Where are the games that are going to be talked about? And I think that are going to be talked about the way that Black Panther was talked about. And I hope that I'm sitting in the room with the people who are going to work on the Black Panther of video games, right? Games that are played by hundreds of millions of people, and who are inspired by you, who have had their lives changed by you, and who will go forward and say, yeah, you know, that game, that was part of what got me where I am today. Now, in terms of propaganda games, we can look at the easiest example, right? The first-person shooter. This is America's Army. Has anybody heard about that? Yeah, a couple of people. So this was a game that was released in the early 2000s. That was funded by the US government to show how life was in the American Army. And you can imagine it as being slightly more realistic than Call of Duty, but still showcasing a certain message and having the mechanics of you have a gun and you shoot. Then, side by side with that, you have Special Force. Has anybody heard about this? Okay, this was a game that was commissioned by the Lebanese government, right? Again, to showcase life in the Lebanese army and to show the enemies of the Lebanese state. Now, these two games are more or less mechanically identical. You have a gun and you shoot. Now, you can imagine how people from America saw America's army, right? And how they saw a Middle Eastern game which was telling you to shoot at people. So you can see that even if you have the same mechanics, what's important is how you wrap your message, and we're going to have a look at we're going to have a closer look at that in a moment. Then you have election games. I don't know how many of you were um, active for the last general election, or how many of you know that France last year had a general election, well, no, presidential election. But in France, what one of the candidates did was get out a game called Fiscal Combat, which was showing that candidate, Mélenchon, fighting the other presidential candidates, right? And that was a really good PR tool, and it showed that this candidate, who was unsuccessful, by the way, was better than everybody else. Right about the same time, when the general elections happened here, we had Corbyn Run, which was a game that was initially unaffiliated with the Labour Party, but later was adopted by them, which was showing Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, fighting against Conservative Party ideals. So you can see here Jeremy Corbyn in the... no, I don't have a laser. Okay. In the bottom, fighting the ghost of Margaret Thatcher, right? A very prominent conservative leader. So you can see that games are already starting to be used by elections, and actually recently the Labour Party had a game jam where they actually where they encourage people to make games to support Labour messages. And then, so this is politics. This is international politics earlier and local politics now. But we can try and step away from politics when we're talking about propaganda. And this is the website of a game designer called Mole Industria. Has anybody seen their games? Okay, yeah. What did you play?
I played the McDonald's game. I think that was by them.
Okay. What did you play, Sharon?
I also played a lot of McDonald's games.
Okay. Did anybody play the oil game?
Yes.
Or petrol game? Right, so this person makes games to showcase various various ideologies and various messages. So they made games about McDonald's, right? They made games about the oil industry. They made games about military drones. They made games about gentrification. All of these are current events that are happening. And what they did was put a certain point of view on it and get the player to empathize with that point of view by by creating the game's goals. For example, in the game that I played the most here, which is the oil drilling game, you are an oil magnate and you have to make as much money as possible by creating drill sites, by influencing politicians and lobbyists, and by passing votes in your favor and fighting negative press. Those are the mechanics of the game. At no point do you have a climate change meter. At no point do you have an eco meter or a meter to show how you affect the local population. You can see that because the game shows it to you, but you can't interact with it because your goals, the mechanics of the game, are pushing you to this specific point of view, being an oil magnet, right? And this, I highly encourage you to go and play any of these games because it's a really good way of seeing how mechanics can affect point of view and how you can create propaganda simply through mechanics. Or rather, how you can create propagandistic messages through what you don't show, right? As I said, in the oil game, you don't allow the player to act positively upon the environment. That's not an option. And that's what propaganda is all about. It's about putting forward a certain perspective, a certain point of view, and either not showing or not allowing the player, in our case, to interact with the elements that you don't want them to interact with. Right? Now, there's 4 steps to skinning a game for propaganda. Once you have chosen to go this route. The first one is to understand that game mechanics are not copyrighted. You've seen a lot of game clones, right? Nobody has copyrighted the first-person shooter mechanics. Nobody has copyrighted the Monopoly mechanics. And that's because game mechanics are not copyrighted. That's brilliant from our point of view because we can do anything that we want. Then you need to choose a game. You need to choose a message or a doctrine or an ideology, and then the last step is to combine the previous two and to impress your propaganda or message upon the game. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you a couple of games from the socialist period in Romania, board games, which showcase these ideals. They are games which are mechanically almost identical to other games that you're going to be familiar with, but which have been skinned to show a certain point of view. So if any of you are familiar with asset flips, they're exactly the opposite, right? And that's because mechanically they're all the same, but they've had their graphical assets changed. So the first one is a game called Enigma. It looks like this. Does it look familiar to you? Well, yeah, and that's because the board is exactly the same one as Clue, and the mechanics are exactly the same ones as Clue. So I'll read to you the description of the game from the game manual. A few friends have left the city and went on a state-mandated holiday in the Romanian mountainside. At some point, they saw a rabbit which was dead. Being July, which is a day where you are not allowed to hunt rabbits, it was clear that that rabbit had been poached. The enigma is to find out who killed the rabbit, where, and using what weapon. Once you answer these three questions, you will find whether or not you were correct in identifying the killer. So, identically, this was Clue. Why they chose Clue, I think that we can have a whole debate. Why they didn't choose Clue in and of itself, I think we can have a whole debate. Maybe something to do with people actually owning property and vanity items. Or maybe it was something different. However, what you can see is that they have started impressing certain messages upon the players. First, you play as a group of friends who go together on a state-mandated holiday, because if it wasn't state-mandated, you shouldn't go on holiday unless you're really, really sick, and that's just taking sick leave. Second, you're going to the mountainside in Romania, because of course we have the best mountainsides ever. And third, one of you has done something illegal, no matter how small it is, such as killing the rabbit. However, you should definitely snitch on them and report them to the authorities. The second example is the Good Landlords game. It looks kind of like this. Can anybody identify the board?
That's Monopoly.
Yeah, it's similar to Monopoly. And however, in Monopoly, which is very capitalist, I don't know who here actually knows about the history of Monopoly? Okay, cool. So Monopoly in and of itself was originally devised as a game against capitalism, and it ended up just being a very capitalist game because guess what? People like winning. However, what you do here is you need to gather enough money by going around the track, around the game of life, and gather enough money to buy an apartment. Well, buying was a very nebulous, buying property was a very nebulous concept back then, but let's just say buy an apartment. And then you're competing, once you do that, you're competing against your friends in order to have the best furniture for your apartment, right? So you play the lottery, you go to the corner shop, you use public transport, you go to the museum, and all of these activities which were more or less sponsored by the state, right? And here you have the cards which were in the equivalent of the community chest. So I'll just, for people here who don't know Romanian, I'm going to read a few of these. So top left one says for working harder than your colleagues, you have earned 100 currency. The top right one is my favorite. It says it doesn't give you a bonus. It simply says read. Reading is an enjoyable, fun, and instructive activity. That's all it says. Then bottom left says that you have taken a cruise ship trip down the Danube because Romania has the Danube in it. It's the last country which has the Danube in the east, and it just tells you to move to a certain square and to pay some money, and so on and so forth. So these were state mandated messages or state approved messages rather, which ended up being in the game. The reason why that happened is because back in socialist times, any piece of media had to be approved by a committee, and if that committee decided that you had unpatriotic messages in it, in your piece of media, they wouldn't publish it because there was only one publishing house, right? And I think you've seen this starting to happen maybe in the UK as well, with sites being blocked by your ISPs because they don't contain safe messages or safe media. But I'll stay away from that. So the idea here was that 1, you're part of a family and you should buy an apartment. 2, you're competing more or less with everybody else at the who's playing the game to have better furniture in your apartment and to have a really great social life. Now what I'd like to do is go through a small example exercise with you, and we are going to skin a game for propaganda. So to begin with, we're going to vote to choose a message that we're going to impress upon a game. So you have 3 options. First one is that Elon Musk will reinvent the religion of the God King Tesla and use it to conquer Earth and colonize Mars. The second one is that fossil fuel is the future and all renewable energy is a scam. And the third one is that all world leaders are secret lizard men trying to keep humanity in the dark about the true nature of the Earth, that it's flat. Right. So let's choose a message. Show of hands. Who's for the left hand message? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Who's for the middle message? Okay. So is everybody else for the lizard people then? Cool. That's the message that we choose, right? We want to convince the players of this game that all world leaders are secret lizardmen trying to make sure that everybody else believes that the world is flat. To do that, we'll choose Battleship, and we're going to skin it. Has anybody here not played Battleship, or doesn't know about it? Okay, cool. I've had various results with that. So what should the players represent here? Remember that what we're trying to do is convince whoever's playing the game that lizard men are definitely running the world, and that they're trying to make sure that the world knows that the Earth is flat. So what should the players represent? Because in the original Battleship you had ship admirals or navy admirals, right? So what would they be here?
Countries.
Okay. Lizardmen, countries, why for both of them?
Well, we're talking about world leaders, so it definitely means countries and states.
Mm-hmm.
So where the world leader would be.
Okay, so the 2 players represent world leaders.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody else said lizardmen.
Yeah, like lizard men world leaders.
Okay, right. So let's just go with that. At the moment, instead of having navy admirals, we have lizard people who are also secret world leaders who are playing this game, right? That's what our players represent. And how can we express the goal? Because before, our goal was to sink the other person's navy, right? Sink the other person's ship. Now we're lizard people. We're world leaders. What should be our goal?
You could still make it to sink the battleships because you'd be trying to stop them from sailing far enough that they could realise that the world actually isn't flat. So they can actually sail around the world, just trying to stop them from reaching that point.
Okay, so maybe they're not necessarily military ships. Maybe they're what, news ships or reporter ships, something like that.
Trying to stop them from telling everyone that the world's actually a sphere.
Okay, anybody else? No? Okay. We said that the battleships are going to be some sort of news crew ships. And what are the players shooting? Are you still because you have to remember that this is a symmetrical game, right? So both players have these ships which are full of reporters, ideally, right? Um, who are just moving around in the international waters. So you're trying to stop the other player ships from finding out that the Earth is actually spherical.
You could be, you know, putting down their transition channels so they can't actually communicate.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
they're news ships, so they have to send out whatever they find
Okay.
to
Yeah.
the public. So then you just
Right. So maybe you're shooting some sort of interference missiles,
yeah.
something like that. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Everybody else agrees with that? Right. So how would you sell this? Right? You're what, in your second, third years, at some point you're going to have to do an elevator pitch, better sooner rather than later. So you have this game where the players are suddenly representing lizard people. They want to keep the world in the dark about the fact that the Earth is actually round. And you find somebody who believes this, right? They believe this hypothesis, and you have to sell the game to them. How would you sell it? Imagine that this person is a game publisher, and they're about to give you a whole lot of money if you can convince them of that your game will further their message.
Show examples of it working, I guess.
Okay.
Like game, example like with the actual games, you have like teaser trailers, you have all those sort of like marketing, publicity, all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You want to try and sell it to a publisher, show them videos of people actually playing it, actually like sort of reading into it, understanding what's actually going on, that sort of stuff.
Okay. You don't always have your phone on you though to show them a trailer.
Play with them.
You don't always have your game. The idea of the elevator pitch is that you meet this person in an elevator and you have to pitch the game to them. So something like 10-15 seconds in a couple of sentences.
Title.
Okay. What would you title it? Hmm?
I personally don't know yet.
Yeah.
I can't do anything on the spot.
Lying lizardman.
Lying lizardman. Okay, that's not exactly marketing friendly. So you go to somebody and you're like, hey, I have this game, Lying Lizardman. I need you to invest some money in it, right? Because to make this happen, because I know you're a great believer in the idea that lizardmen are ruling the world. In this game, continue the sentence. So how would you continue that sentence? In this game, yeah.
You have to explain the game mechanics. You have to go do this and do that, and it'd be more of a fun. I tried like a sort of tongue-in-cheek game instead. It wouldn't be a serious one
Mm-hmm.
because people don't like serious.
Okay. So it's a sarcastic game that's covertly gets the world to agree with our message. Wink, wink. Right, that sort of thing. Okay. Cool. No, that sounds really good. It took us 10 minutes to come up with an idea of skinning a game for propaganda for a very far-reaching theory. Right? If we're to take things which are slightly less controversial, and I'll let you think about that, think about everything that you hear in the media every day, you can see how if it took us 10 minutes, right, and I'm sitting in a room with artists who could actually go and make this game and skin this game, how other people could do the same if they actually have a big budget and a team that's really experienced. So that's why it's important for you to realize that propaganda exists and is out there, and that it's quite cheap in terms of resources to impress a message upon a game. And I want to go back to this, saying that propaganda is not good or bad. However, as game developers, we have a responsibility to be aware of the choices that we make in our game. We have a responsibility, right, to do our research. When we don't know the answers, to ask other people who might know them. Welcome. We have a responsibility to not be ignorant and to be informed, right? You're going into the world. Some of you at least. Who here is a third year? Okay, who expects to graduate this year? Okay, you're being optimistic. That's good. You're going into the world in June, July, something like that. Maybe even earlier, right? Maybe you want to get hired at a game studio. Maybe you want to make your own games. Keep these things in mind, that it's your responsibility to be aware of the design choices that you make and of the messages that you put into your game, of the mistakes that you might inadvertently make. That's why it's important to always play test your games. When I was at Ubisoft, I had to create some side missions, taxi activities, right, driving missions. It was left to my own personal opinion about to choose the narrative of these missions. Right, I could have chosen anything. I could have created and put forward any number of ideas. They still had to pass creative control from our creative director, but still, I had those choices and I had that responsibility, right? And because it was a game that was based in San Francisco, I chose various very liberal messages. What's important though is that, and what kind of stuck with me, was the fact that I created that content and that I created those narratives and that I could have told any story. And that's what I want you to leave here today with. And that's that design decisions matter. You're going out there, you're going to be creating content that tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of people are going to interact with. Imagine millions of people being impressed by your message, by any decision that you make, and then realize that that's a responsibility, and that's a privilege, and it's also a responsibility. Thank you. Alright, I think we have about 10-15 minutes to actually talk about this. If anybody has any questions or comments. Okay. Yeah.
Are there any mainstream games in the past couple of years that you would consider to be propaganda?
I think that all games can be used for that. Games which show certain points of view can definitely be seen as propaganda. You look at the military shooters who tell you shoot that guy, not that guy. You look at even games like open world games, right? You look at GTA, and you look at all of the points that they're trying to make, and they're using sarcasm. Speaking of what we were talking about earlier, to make their point. But that's a certain skewed point of view. Yeah. You look at games like Papo-Yo, if anybody has played it, and you see how they manage to get their point across. I'm not saying that that's propaganda, but that's a game that impresses a very powerful point to the player. And looking at how to use mechanics to impress a certain point of view, my personal favorite example is Undertale, which has managed to make it more interesting to try and not be violent rather than be violent in the game. I absolutely love that. So yeah, I think there's you can look at any number of games and see the messages that they were trying to put out there, right? Have you played Her Story? So yeah, does that answer your question? Yes, the answer is yes. Yeah. And I think there's another yes.
I just thought about this because what about propaganda that basically just exists in a game world or like in like a made up world? Like if you think about Wolfenstein, Bioshock, or Harry Potter,
Yes.
they made like there were like whole graphic teams working on just making it believable, but it doesn't exist in our world, and some things are not really like you can't translate them into the real world.
What
Or
do
maybe you can, but
you chose two examples, which I'm like, okay, I see where you're going, and then you chose Harry Potter. I'm like, wait, I mean,
I was thinking about just the whole, like the leaflets you find and the flyers and everything, and it's all like on the same level. I know two of them are games, but it's just a world someone made up.
yeah.
Um,
So that's where the responsibility of your responsibility as a creator comes into play. That's exactly what I was talking about earlier with my Ubisoft example. I haven't gone into details of the missions, and I can tell you exactly what I meant later on. If you've played the game, you know what I'm talking about. But when you look at it, you have artistic freedom, right? When you create a leaflet, when you create a brand, when you create a story, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize. It's that no matter how small your part in creating this world, in being part of this world, fair enough, J.K. Rowling, she did her own thing, but Bioshock, Wolfenstein were created by hundreds of people, and no matter how small your part in the game, you can still send a message. I think that's beautiful. You see that in the film industry. You see that in the games industry as well. Maybe in the games industry even more, since everybody can actually put something in the game. And while Wolfenstein and Bioshock were politically charged games, completely different points of view, but they were politically charged, you can look at all of the side art that was created for it, and see those decisions at play, right? And I think if we leave Wolfenstein to the side for a sec, if we look at Bioshock and what they were trying to do about showcasing libertarian ideals within this fantasy world, I think that definitely there was a creative team and an art team there that worked under somebody's vision for creating those messages, and they did a really great job. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. Yeah.
Do you believe that any games that they've like demonstrated a negative form of propaganda, but they've been able to demonstrate it in a way where it affects the people, so they actually make a positive move to actually try and tackle that? So like the Division, when they're like showing how a pandemic can completely ruin the nation, and there's a way for players to understand that and to try and stop that from even happening.
Yeah, that's part of the power of games, and that's what's really important, especially when you do stuff like mechanics design and enemy design, right? Because if you look at the Division, you had the looters, you had the firemen, and all of the enemies that they created. There were actually some pieces in the press at the time that the Division was released, talking about this and how they stereotype looters, right? So from that point of view, you can say that it's propaganda, because when that game was designed, the only mechanic that you had was shooting to deal with this, right? Which again leads me to what I was talking about with Undertale. Any mechanic decision that you're going to take about including it into your game or not is going to affect the player somehow, and that's anything from being able to pet a dog in Watch Dogs 2. Right, that was one of our mandates. In this game, we will actually be able to pet dogs, which was like awesome. I actually think I know the programmer who implemented that, who are very happy to do that. But it's simple things like that. It's things like being aware and being conscious of the mechanics that you design and how they are going to affect the game itself, right? Because that's our job as designers, and how they're going to affect the player. And I think this again puts me back to emphasizing the power of playtesting. So I don't know how many of you have actually done playtesting with your games. Okay, you should start. What's really important is to have a look at the player. If any of you are designing mobile games, you should have a look at plugins which actually manage to capture the face of your, to use the front camera to capture the face of the player while they're playing the game, and see how, and then in post editing, put those two things side by side. What's on the screen of the game, what's the player's face, and see how they react to various decisions that you make. And when you're looking at really high budget games, what's going to happen is that you actually get to sit in a room and watch 12 people play the game live. And you can then interact with them and ask them, why did you take that decision? What did you think of X, Y, Z? You have to go through a training to be able to ask the right questions, but it's so important to see what they think about the world, what they think about the mechanics, and how they interacted and why they took certain decisions. Especially in games, in open world games, and in GTA, you had the famous example that everybody quotes. In GTA, you can hire a prostitute and then you shoot her, right? You have to ask yourself, why do people do that? It's not necessarily um, as important when you ask, why did the designers do that, right? That's a good question as well, and there are a lot of answers for that. But it's also important to see how people interacted when they were given that option.
But sometimes specifically with the mechanics and the messages that they're trying to convey, it doesn't particularly connect with the actual game itself. So like with Watch Dogs 2,
Mm-hmm.
the character, it seems so friendly and so like nice, and he's just he's like a normal person. But then like a few minutes later, he's just going out on like a massive murder spree, and like, okay, that's that character, and then he's that in a cutscene, like
Mm-hmm.
completely disconnected.
Well, that's because you have to give the players choices. You can, looking back again at Watch Dogs 2, and again, it's important to emphasize that I'm no longer working for Ubisoft, so what I'm saying is completely anecdotal. But in Watch Dogs 2, you could finish the game without shooting a single bullet, without killing a single person. That's that's designing a game to keep player agency in mind. If you would want to design a game where players can't shoot weapons, that's totally up to you. That wasn't necessarily the mandate, and that wasn't the game that was being created. What was really important for us was to give the players that choice, right? Personally, I think there was a huge improvement between the what you could do in Watch Dogs 1, what you could do in Watch Dogs 2, right?
Yeah.
And in the characters themselves as well.
How do you, like, you were speaking about how you put your kind of ideals of like San Francisco into whatever game it was you were making, but how do you make propaganda for a source you could say you don't believe? Because like the game we skinned, we were meant to be pro Lizardmen. By the end of it, it was a sarcastic, satirical take because no one in this room believes that the world is run by Lizardmen and it's full of facts.
Yeah.
So how would you try and do a propaganda game of your propaganda ideals for something you don't believe in and still try and make it stand out?
I believe that there are very few subjects that you can't find an angle that you agree with. They exist clearly, and I think that you'll find that once you actually start doing research and seeing other people's point of view and empathize with them, then you can start using their examples to inform your decisions. This goes into something that isn't necessarily on my mandate today about ethics, because at some point you might be given a mandate to make a game that you clearly don't believe in and that you don't even want to support. So then the question is, do you just quit your job? Which is something that people have done. There were stories about that, and that's something that you need to decide for yourself. When I interviewed for Electronic Arts for a QA position way back in the day when I was 18, I was asked from the beginning, would you play and actively play a Barbie game? Right? Because they were like, oh, you're a guy. Guys would never like to play with dolls. Leaving that to the side, their whole question was similar to yours. Could you get involved with a game that you don't necessarily play or that you don't necessarily believe in? my answer was, yeah, of course, you pay me money. um, However, when you go deeper into this, when you go into the design side, it's exactly the same question that you would need to ask any other artist, right? Would you would you take photography if you were a very traditional person who believed in the traditional family? You're also a photographer. Would you accept to take photos of a gay wedding? It's exactly the same question, and it's always up to you, the artist. Now, in terms of not looking at something that's controversial, but it's just something that you don't know or that you don't really feel attracted to. For example, that you're a Pepsi person and you need to design a game for Coca-Cola, right? Then the idea is, if it doesn't affect your personal beliefs, you learn more about it. You learn more about why people support it, and then you start talking and doing your research with people who share that point of view. That's, I think, what's really important when you look at this. Or, for example, say you're commissioned to do a game about South American culture. You know nothing about South American culture. So again, you do your research, you talk to the experts. Otherwise, you're going to end up misrepresenting points of view and people and cultures, and you don't want to do that.
Do you believe that? Do you want to go? Yeah, I've had a few questions already. So.
In regards to your point about game developers having a responsibility for the messages they have in their games, in an interview about Detroit Become Human, Nick Cage talked about how he had no intention of having a message or having a particular point of view in his game, and that he wanted just to present, I don't know, the case and then let players decide.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that? Because that seems to me that is kind of shirking the responsibility of having messages in your game.
It all depends if you think you can be 100% objective. And when you look at it, even with something as vast as Nick Cage's work, where you can take any decision, any path that you want, or so we're being told, you still, in our medium, have to program the choices and their effects. And it's up to the creative director to come up with what those choices and effects would be, or at least to veto them or to verify them. Personally, I think that no decision is made in a vacuum. I believe that we're being shaped by the culture around us, and that we're all shaped by our histories and by the media. That's why I think it's really important. That's why I think diversity is really important, because people have different paths, different experiences, and it's important to get their points of view and input into it. So if you look at it, something that I was going to say earlier, before you guys started asking me really awesome questions, was you look at the role of guns in games which are made in the States, and the role of guns in games which are made in Japan. And Extra Credits have done a really awesome episode on this, and I highly encourage you to watch it if you haven't. The whole idea is that when you look at guns, Japan, the US, completely different points of view on them, right? So it's exactly the same with what Nick Cage was saying. When you look at it, even if your intention isn't to have a subjective take on something, any decision that you make is going to be influenced by everything that's behind you: culture, media, history. And that's, if you believe you can still be objective, then that's perfectly fine. Personally, I think all of those can create an unconscious subjectiveness. Subjectivity, sorry. Yeah, anyone else? Yes.
I was wondering, at what point does something become propaganda? Would you say, like, where's the line?
I think it's when you don't mention certain things, when you focus on one point of view and you make it not necessarily narrow, but you forget or choose not to mention other points of view. So looking at the oil game, right, from Mole Industria, the idea was that you are only showing the point of view of the oil magnet. Everything else is put down to the side, not not interactive with, and that's why I think that that's a propaganda game. Even if it doesn't show a political message in nature, it's showing an ideological message. And what it does is it puts you, the player, it gives you, the player, a certain perspective that you can't get out of, even if you tried. So once you take the decision as a designer to only show a certain perspective, a certain point of view, that's when you're actively making propaganda, from my point of view, or from my, in my opinions. Yeah.
So would you consider games like Skyrim that have two opposing factions that shows you both point of views, despite the fact that it's quite political, it's technically not propaganda if it gives you both sides of the situation?
I think so, and I think Skyrim, I think Witcher, the Witcher games are really good at this, at having you be an agent of change, but not giving you complete information, only giving you information either from one point of view or the other, and allowing you to choose. So I think that they are really good games, which could have been very propagandistic, but weren't. I think that's what makes it really interesting. In Witcher, you look at the fight between the rebels, the Scoia'tael, and everybody else, and you're kind of stuck in between. Actually, it's three factions. And yeah, from that point of view, you can say that Star Wars is a propaganda film because they're only showing the rebels' point of view, right? Yeah.
Would you say that games are the best way to like display this? Like it would like best medium
To do what?
to display like propaganda in that? Would you or would you say that films or TV shows or even books like would probably be better than games?
Well, I think games are definitely different. And Sharon and myself were having a discussion earlier exactly about that. You have different affordances in games. Has anybody here read The Design of Everyday Things?
Why not?
Okay. The idea in The Design of Everyday Things is about you crafting affordances into your game. So, for example, the fact that this pen has this part here which is narrower than the rest of the pen allows me to believe that maybe it moves, and it does. It's the same with those doors, where you can only push, not pull, because they don't have a handle. Those are all affordances. Does it sound familiar to anyone here?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Just trying to make sure that we're on the same level. And I think games are a completely different medium from books, completely different medium from posters and from film, because they have different affordances. Films have the advantage of keeping you locked for at least 2 hours, right, for the entirety of the film if you're going to see it at the theater. Theater has the advantage of improv and of allowing actors to actually be in front of you and allow you to create a more deep connection with them. Books have the advantage of the written word. Posters have the advantage that they're flat and they can be very colorful and that they're 2D. And it's the same with games. In games, our advantage is the fact that the player interacts with the stuff that we do. Whether or not that makes them best for propaganda, I don't know, really, is the answer. I think that it's something that any of you can take forward into a master's thesis if you want, and to find that out, try and get a message that that people could believe in, and see whether or not it's easier to impress it with a game or with a film or with music, which is another one that we haven't discussed. And that's what's beautiful in this day and age, and that's what's great about you guys actually, and about game development in and of itself, because at the end of the day, to be game developers, you have to be jacks of all trades, right? You've all learned how to do interactivity, you've all learned how to do visual arts. If any of you have ever tried putting sounds or making music for a game, you now have that experience as well. If any of you have written stories or narrative for a game, you have that experience as well. So you've seen how many types of art go into creating a game, and you've seen how people interact with games. So that's actually something for you to take forward and answer that. I don't have an answer for that one, sorry.
But don't you think that the affordances can be shared between medias? Say like with film and like games and that. Say like the passive interactions with players, and it could be just by going by like two people and they're speaking about their political views and that.
Mm-hmm.
And active, like the active interaction could be like knocking out one of them if they're like saying something that you don't believe in or something like that. Do you think that there could be a way to actually do that the right way in the game? Because if you're trying to like take both of the influences from like film and game, it's kind of like which way you're going. You're either going one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
In my point of view, you can't really do both of them at the same time. Say like with the Order 1886, like it was mostly cutscenes and then like quick time events, and so it just didn't have the same type of flow that they get in like other shooters and that.
Well, it depends what you mean by right. Doing propaganda right. What do you mean by that?
I don't know, it's hard to explain. Being able to convey both point of views, but like in a way, but yeah, but I mean like from
If you
one
say
story.
2 points of view, I mean that's not really propaganda because propaganda is trying to put people
Only show one of them, yeah.
into one of
Yeah, but
them.
you'd have like one story, but you could have the hero story, and then you play through that, and then you'd have like villain story, and then you play from that. But
Okay.
you choose one or the other.
Have you ever played Fable? They tried doing something like that, and I don't know how well it went. When to begin with, when you're saying hero and villain, means that you're trying to show some actions as being good and others as being bad. So I think here, what give me 1 second here. What you need to do is understand what propaganda is, and then see how different people react to it. Understand who your target audience for that is, because it might be that it's people over 50, right, who have lived through the golden age of the United Kingdom, and it might be that they're not mobile savvy, that they don't play games. For them, propaganda in games wouldn't be effective because they wouldn't know how to interact with it, right? For them, articles in the Sun or in the Daily Mail might be much more effective. It might be that your target audience are university graduates who are on Twitter and on Facebook. So it might be that a poll there or some sort of viral video without sound would be much more effective. Or it might be that your target audience are 15 to 18-year-olds who stay on Twitch all day and watch people play PUBG. It might be that a game that integrates Twitch might be the best one to send a message for them. So games aren't an answer for everybody, and I don't think any art medium is an answer for can interact at the same level with all of the population of the Earth. So define your target audience and understand their habits, their needs, their actions, and then choose what the best medium to send a message to them is. Does that answer your question? Cool. I think that's about all the time that we have,
Yeah.
right?
One last question. Phrase two
You're a
parts
lecturer.
there. Yeah, but I feel
You're
like,
just cheating.
what do you feel about situations which have more than 2 points of view to them, and you only show 2 points of view? So say if there was a game about American politics and you showed the 2 dominant political parties, but not a third party or indeed an anti-stick position, not an intransigent or immigrant's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
If it's still propaganda because it's showing only a partial subset of points of views, is it possible to have a non-propaganda game? Wouldn't a non-propaganda game be one which showed every possible point of view? Or wouldn't that be kind of impossible ask?
I think that you need to look at. I think that the idea here is that as long as you keep your player informed, it's going to be okay. Um, I don't think you can ever show all points of view.
Yeah.
You can do your best to do that. You can do your best to show the majority of the points of view, right? So in the U.S. elections, you have what 95 odd percent of the votes actually going to the main two parties. So you could say that that's good enough. At the same time, until about 5 years ago, most of the world believed that there were only two genders, right? But based on a similar on similar percentages. So it's so I think it's up to you to believe whether or not the majority of points of view is going to be good enough. I don't think you'll ever be able to represent all of them.
So you admit, like, so showing for the sake of it just 2 points of view isn't necessarily guarantee that it's not realistic.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks a lot for coming, and I think I'll see you again after 4.
Yes, so I'd really like you to come back if you possibly can.
Yeah, if you can.
Fall. That would be really great, and then we can have a discussion about a separate subject, which is Game Anglia, and how we might get involved, and how you might foresee a Game Anglia involvement for yourselves. Because Chris is here, he's the organizer of that conference, and it's a really great opportunity to get involved in something in our region, which is very rare. Yes?
Is that back in this room?
Yes, please. That would be great. 4 o'clock.